Hello and welcome to this NPTEL course on Feminist Writings, where we're looking at Bell Hooks' essay, Understanding Patriarchy. We've already studied this essay to a certain degree, and we'll just continue and hopefully begin to wind up this particular text in this lecture. So one of the things which Hooks does in this essay, as we have mentioned already, is that she looks at the entire complexity of patriarchy as an operation, as something which affects men and women. And she takes she moves away from this dualistic understanding of patriarchy as being perpetrated by the men and being suffered by the women, and it becomes a more complex and more inclusive model where men and women become collaborators and colluders. They collude into this entire system of patriarchy in different ways. So there's a overt method of patriarchy, there's a covert method of patriarchy, and in our last lecture we looked at this very disturbing scene where the girl child hooks herself. It was an anecdotal example, an anecdotal episode where she described how she was once beaten up by her father for disobeying the rule, the patriarchal rule of the house, and the disobeying and the entire subversion was done apparently by her choosing to play with marbles. So marbles were sort of symbolized stereotypically as boys' games, boys' playthings, and the fact that she was playing with marbles despite the disapproval of her father, that led to this entire cruel episode, this barbaric, brutal episode of beating and physical abuse that she was subjected to. And of course then the mental abuse of being confined into a small room. And then interestingly at the end, where the mother figure comes and tells her in a very comforting way, seemingly comforting way, that the entire thing, the entire beating was done in a bid to make her a better person. So that episode, if you remember, is a very disturbing, unsettling episode, but it shows us how patriarchy operates in covert and overt ways. Now, in the last lecture we stopped at a point where Hooks also does away with the myth that the commonly assumed myth that in a household where no men are present tend to be more progressive and less patriarchal, and she says that's often not the case, because the absent male can often become the idealized male, the ideal male who's absent or who's idolized because of his absence. And in that particular household, sometimes, more often than not, we see it becoming more patriarchal than what is commonly the case. So and then obviously she talks about how we live in a collective denial about patriarchy, and then she says that if you ask a random person on the streets about physical abuse, discrimination, equality of genders, everyone's going to answer very straightforwardly. But if you pinpoint the problem and say the problem lies in patriarchy, then people tend to become more ambivalent and more hesitant to respond to that kind of a statement. Now she says over here, and this should be on the screen, where she says that clearly we cannot dismantle a system as long as we engage in collective denial about its impact on our lives. So this denial is something that she has a lot of problems with, because she says as long as we don't address the problem, as long as we don't locate and articulate the problem or define the problem as patriarchy, then obviously it's going to be very difficult to dismantle it. So the first step in dismantling a dominant discourse is to acknowledge it, to articulate it, to call it as what it is. And as long as they don't do that, as long as they live in denial, strategic collective denial, then we are not able to do it. We're not able to address the problem, let alone dismantle it. So patriarchy requires male dominance by any means necessary. Hence it supports, promotes and condones sexist violence. So look at the verbs over here, which are quite interesting. Supports, promotes and condones. So it obviously it produces this myth of male superiority. It consolidates the myth, and of course it condones any kind of abuse which is done and seemingly to sustain that myth, to sustain that system. So, and obviously if you go back to the episode where the girl child was being beaten by the authoritative father figure for playing with marbles, so that particular beating, that particular episode was not just condoned, it was supported. It was in a way appreciated in a very perverse way by the mother figure, who comes and tells the child later in a seemingly comforting the child that this is actually done to help you be a better person. So the entire system of violence is produced, promoted and condoned. It's supported and justified by the principles of patriarchy. We hear the most about sexist violence in public discourses, about rape and abuse by domestic partners. But the most common forms of patriarchal violence are those that take place in the home between patriarchal parents and children. So she's saying that we need to locate the problem at the very beginning, sort of nip in the bud, as it were. And she says that if we can address the very inception of patriarchy as a problem, which begins to happen at the level of indoctrination, the level of value indoctrination at home, when children are born into a system, infants are born into a system, and then they grow in a value system which teaches them patriarchal principles through systems of indoctrination, psychological indoctrination, emotional indoctrination, value-based indoctrination, etc. So she says that is probably the most common forms of patriarchal violence, because that violence takes place not just corporally but also mentally and psychologically, and that's a deeper form of violence which needs to be addressed and acknowledged. The point of such violence is usually to reinforce a dominator model in which the authority figure is deemed ruler over those without power and given the right to maintain the rule through practices of subjugation. So subjugation obviously becomes a very important factor, but also along with subjugation, she says, subordination and submission. So it's like inventing a system, inventing an architecture of power and control, an archaeology of power, as it were. And then the whole point of that invention is to have a father figure, an authoritative figure on top, who becomes the dominator figure. And that dominator figure sort of suppresses other people, and the whole point is to subjugate, subordinate, and submit. So the three S's over here, subjugation, subordination, and submission, become very crucial categories in patriarchy, because that's how patriarchy operates. And I mean, like any grand narrative, the best way for patriarchy to operate is to create, consensual collaborators, consensual subjects. So if you can control someone by consent, then that becomes the most efficient and the most effortless form of control, because you don't have to dominate physically or mentally anymore, because you've indoctrinated them completely. So the indoctrination, if that is done completely, absolutely, unequivocally, then obviously there's no requirement at all for you to dominate at any overt level. So keeping males and females from telling the truth about what happens to them in families is one way patriarchal culture is maintained. So withholding the truth, not talking about what happens, not talking about the system of indoctrination, the very covert systems through which children are taught to be patriarchal, not talking about this at all is one way in which patriarchal culture is maintained. So patriarchal authority, culture, power, these are maintained through strategic silences, or structures of silences in a way, because we don't talk about it, we don't address it, we don't articulate it. And because of the fact that we don't articulate it clearly, the silence becomes an instrument to consolidate the entire architecture of patriarchy, the architecture of authority, which is spearheaded, as it were, by a patriarchal figure. A great majority of individuals enforce an unspoken rule in the culture as a whole that demands we keep the secrets of patriarchy, thereby protecting the rule of the father. So, by not talking about the core problem and not talking about the real problem of patriarchy, we consolidate and protect the rule of the father, the phallocentric father. This rule of silence is upheld when a culture refuses everyone easy access to even the word patriarchy. And this is interesting because she says even in a common currency of conversation and exchange, even the word patriarchy occurs so rarely. It rarely comes up. We talk about abuse, we talk about rape, we talk about violence, and these are big words which everyone agrees are bad words, negative things which should be done away with. But when it comes to the core problem from which all of these emanate as conditions, that core problem is hardly addressed, it's hardly named, it's hardly used, it's hardly articulated. So even the word patriarchy at a superficial semantic level doesn't appear in common conversations and colloquial discourses where these things are talked about. Most children do not learn what to call the system of institutionalized gender roles. So rarely do we name it in everyday speech. So it doesn't occur in everyday conversations. So the fact that it's actually almost absent, almost erased from everyday conversations, makes it more of a spectral presence which is not addressed. And because it's not addressed, it becomes something like an omniscient spectral presence through which this kind of indoctrination is consolidated. This silence promotes denial. So what's the purpose of the silence? To promote denial, to encourage denial, to encourage a non-dialogue about this. So, a lack of a dialogue about this, lack of any kind of discourse about patriarchy. So there's a strategic quality about the silence, about this collective silence to address the problem as patriarchy, as Hooks keeps emphasizing. And how can we organize to challenge and change a system that cannot be named? So if you can't even name a system, so by not naming the system, you're giving this a quality of absolute authority, because by not naming it, we don't identify it. By not identifying it, we can't question it. And by not questioning it, you just consume it as some kind of a natural given. It's like breathing, oxygen. You don't even have to be aware of it. It's just there. It's just something you do as a metabolic biological activity. So the whole point of the silence is to create a system of seamlessness. It just becomes a seamless activity, a seamless engagement, a seamless consumption, an unquestioned consumption through which patriarchy operates as a grand narrative, as a principle of authority, a principle of control and coercion. So by drawing our attention to the fact that even the word patriarchy doesn't occur in daily conversations, by drawing our attention to the fact that we don't address the core problem of violence, domestic abuse, gender discrimination with the core thing called patriarchy, Hooks is actually saying that patriarchy is so deep-seated in our psyche, in our cultural psyche, in our collective psyche, that we feel reluctant, we feel uncomfortable to talk about it, as men as well as women. Okay, and that discomfort is something that she is addressing very, very clearly and very pointedly throughout this essay. And hence it's called, hence it's named, hence it's titled Understanding Patriarchy. The whole point of this, the whole objective of this is to examine the ontology of patriarchy, the function of patriarchy, patriarchy as an ontological category, patriarchy as a functional category. How does it function? How does it come into being? How does it materialize into some kind of a spectral existence without a name? And hence the word spectral becomes sort of doubly important over here. And then she goes on to say, it is no accident that feminists began to use the word patriarchy to replace the more commonly used male chauvinism and sexism. These courageous voices wanted men and women to become more aware of the way patriarchy affects us all. So instead of the more provocative words such as male chauvinism and sexism, feminists, after a point of time, began to use the word patriarchy and began to address the core problem by using the word patriarchy. And Hooks seems to appreciate this move, this maneuver. And she describes this woman as courageous voices who wanted men and women to become more aware of the way patriarchy affects us all. And that's something that she keeps saying throughout the essay. The patriarchy is a system, patriarchy is a condition, almost a medical condition, almost a pathological condition, which affects men and women, perhaps men more than women, because men then become consumers of patriarchy, which effaces their agency, the human agency, and then after a point of time they become perpetrators of patriarchy. They become, people who use patriarchy to dominate, to create violence, etc. But the first step is the violence against themselves by moving away from what they really want to do as agentic individuals. The patriarchy takes away your your agency and your individuality, and then it just makes you a model, it just makes you a cog in the wheel of a larger system which functions by making you function in a particular way, by making you conform to a certain code of conduct. So in popular culture, the word itself was hardly used during the heyday of contemporary feminism. So she, in a way, is critiquing feminism as well for not addressing the core problem of patriarchy, for using other words, using other discourses, other nomenclatures, without really talking about the core problem which affects men and women and from which everything else emanates. Anti-male activists were no more eager than their sexist male counterparts to emphasize the system of patriarchy and the way it works. So even anti-male activists, and she seems to have problems with that nomenclature as well, anti-male activists, because that seems to be sustaining some kind of a dualism of men versus women, men being bad, women being powerless. And it has a very reductionist idea of agency, a very reductionist idea of gender discrimination, a very reductionist idea, a very simplistic idea of power as it operates in a gender space. So anti-male activists, as well as sexist male counterparts, were both can be accused of not emphasizing, of not addressing the problem of patriarchy. So anti-male activists were no more eager to talk about patriarchy than the sexist male counterparts, who would obviously not talk about patriarchy because they are privileged by patriarchy. So why would you want to name a system, why would you want to identify a system which privileges you by default, which privileges you, almost in a subconscious way, in a subconscious system? For to do so would have automatically exposed the notion that men were all powerful and women powerless, that all men were oppressive and women always and only victims. So this entire, like I said, this reductionist, simplistic idea that all men are patriarchal, all men are powerful, and men are all powerful and women are all powerless, this very simplistic idea of gender discrimination would have been exposed, would have been dismantled. So in a very interesting way, both fiercely firebrand anti-male activists and very sexist male people, chauvinists, both were equally reluctant to use the word patriarchy in a very interesting way, because obviously, as I mentioned, the male chauvinists, the sexist male chauvinists, they wouldn't use the word patriarchy because that obviously would then expose the problem at a very core level. But equally interestingly, the anti-male activists would just engage themselves with more provocative, more fashionable terms, more loaded terms such as sexism, violence, and rape, abuse, etc., without really talking about the real problem from which everything else emanates, patriarchy. And also, anti-male activists were equally interested in sustaining the system which looked at men being all bad and all powerful and women being all powerless and all victims. So this kind of a system was useful for anti-male activists as well, because the whole point of being anti-male is to identify the male as an absolute villain, as an unequivocal villain, as someone who just perpetrates patriarchy as a machine without having any kind of ambivalence about him. So the whole point that Hooks is trying to say over here is we need to have a more ambivalent understanding, a more complex understanding of how patriarchy operates, and we can only do it if we identify the problem of patriarchy, if we call it by its name, if we identify the word patriarchy and begin to use it in common conversations and popular discourses about gender and gender roles. So by placing the blame for the perpetuation of sexism solely on men, these women could maintain their own allegiance to patriarchy, their own lust for power. So it's a very radical essay because it takes an insider's critique. It offers you an insider's critique of feminism as well. That brand of feminism, that very blunt brand of feminism, which talks about men, which basically becomes a male-bashing enterprise, which talks about men being villains, men being perpetrators, men being promoters and perpetrators of patriarchy, and women being passive sufferers who need to be rescued. Now, obviously, that kind of a discourse, that kind of a narrative is in itself quite sexist in quality, as Hooks is attempting to articulate to us, to sort of convey to us. Because if we believe in that model, if we sustain the model that men are all powerful and all bad, and women are all powerless and all sad, then obviously we are sort of getting trapped into the very binary of powerful and powerless, male and female, that patriarchy wants us to be in. Right? So in a way, we become collaborators in patriarchy by being anti-male activists. So the whole idea of being an anti-male activist, the whole idea of being a sort of a blunt feminist who talks about these problems without looking at the complexity of patriarchy, is actually does no service at all, according to Hooks's understanding over here, to the real plight of men and women who are actually equal sufferers of patriarchy in different kinds and different conditions and different forms. So the marks by they over here, Hooks is talking about those feminists, those women who understand feminism as being an anti-male, a male-bashing enterprise. So they marks their longing to be dominators by taking on the mantle of victimhood. So one of the many things which this essay does, quite interestingly and quite radically, I think, is that it really problematizes the entire ontology of victimhood. So she says over here quite clearly that by pretending to be victims all the time, by pretending that women are the victims all the time, these brand of feminists, these feminists were actually wanting to do is because they were wanting to be the dominators. They were wanting to be in a position of power, in a position of saying that the spokesperson for women, occupying positions of power in the feminist mappings, etc., by taking on the mantle of victimhood. The victimhood over here becomes a strategic position to occupy. Because if you're just saying I'm a victim all the time, that actually makes you sort of a spokesperson for all the victims in the world, all the victims who are women. So victimhood over here becomes a very problematic category, and Hooks obviously wants to move away from this very easy assumption of victimhood, from this very easy association of victimhood with women. And she says we need to have a more complex understanding of how patriarchy operates as a system which makes men and women equal victims and perpetrators in different degrees and in different forms and different conditions. And then she goes on to say, like many visionary radical feminists, I challenge the misguided notion put forward by women who are simply fed up with male exploitation and oppression that men were the enemy. Now, as I mentioned, that if we subscribe to that system of feminism which talks about men as being the enemy, then obviously what you're doing, among many things, what you're doing is you are sustaining the binary, you're sustaining the dualism of men versus women, men being privileged, women being passive, men being agentic, women being agency-less. And the whole point, the whole activism, the whole discourse, and becomes a very, very reductionist kind of a discourse, a very simplistic discourse of understanding. And she says, oh yeah, quite clearly, we need to move away as feminists, as people who believe in equality of gender, people who believe in the problem of patriarchy, people who seek to understand and address the problem of patriarchy. We need to move away from this model of men being the enemy, because that model actually reifies certain categories, which then makes it impossible for you to question and examine those categories as textual, and material and experiential categories. Because once you reify a category as either the enemy or the sufferer, then it becomes almost impossible to deconstruct it and to examine it through different kind of investigative instruments. And she says quite clearly, as early as 1984, I included a chapter with the title "Men, Comrades in Struggle" in my book Feminist Theory from Margin to Center. So she says, when I was writing my book Feminist Theory from Margin to Center, I actually had a chapter called Men, Comrades in Struggle. So obviously by talking about men as being partners in this problem and people who are co-sufferers in this problem, she's offering a more complex and more inclusive model of patriarchy, which that needs to be addressed and tackled in a more deconstructionist kind of a manner. And then she says quite clearly, the point of including the chapter called Men, Comrades in Struggle is for urging advocates of feminist politics to challenge any rhetoric which places the sole blame for perpetuating patriarchy and male domination onto men. So again, if you are sort of putting or locating the entire blame of patriarchy on men alone, then, like I said, you're retaining or replicating the dualistic structure. You're reifying categories, and by reifying categories, you're sort of making it possible to investigate those categories as fluid, dynamic, textual, material, experiential constructs, because then those are reified by default. And once you reify something, you can't really question it from any kind of investigative distance or instrumentalization. And this is the quotation that she offers, should be on the screen at the moment, where she says, separatist ideology encourages women to ignore the negative impact of sexism on male personhood. So if you're going for a separatist ideology, if you're going for an ideology of men versus women, women versus men, then obviously you are encouraged to ignore the entire negative impact of patriarchy on men, on the male psyche as well. It stresses polarization between the sexes. So instead of collaboration, it encourages and stresses and promotes polarization. And that's something which does a disservice to feminism as well as to men. So Hooks is quite clearly, she's taking a more inclusive stance about patriarchy, about tackling the problem of patriarchy. So she says we can't antagonize men, we can't polarize men as feminists, because if we do that, the entire thing becomes a male versus woman war, which is what patriarchy thrives on, essentially. So if you are to really beat the problem of patriarchy, we really want to deconstruct the problem of patriarchy, we need to have men we need to look at men as comrades in struggle, as people who suffer patriarchy before they become perpetrators of patriarchy, right? And unless you can do that, we will keep continuing this very sexist discourse of separation, the separatist ideology of men versus women, and that's something that she has a lot of problems with. According to Joy Justice, separatists believe that there are two basic perspectives on the issue of naming the victims of sexism. There is the perspective that men oppress women, and there is a perspective that people are people, that we are all hurt by rigid sex roles. Both perspectives are accurately describe our predicament. Men do oppress women. People are hurt by rigid sexist role patterns. These two realities coexist. Male oppression of women cannot be excused by the recognition that there are ways men are hurt by rigid sexist roles. Feminist activists should acknowledge that hurt and work to change it. It exists. So what we see over here is an attitude of ambivalence. It's an acknowledgement of ambivalence, and that's a very, very interesting and complex thing to do. What Hooks is doing in this particular essay. And she said, unless we acknowledge the ambivalence that men are hurt by patriarchy and then men are perpetrators of patriarchy, so both exist simultaneously, both co-inhabit the entire mappings of patriarchy, the entire mappings, the entire operation of patriarchy. So unless we acknowledge this cohabitation, unless we acknowledge this ambivalence, it becomes almost impossible to really address the problem. So instead of separation, instead of a binary, instead of looking at dualism of men versus women, she's offering an ambivalence. She's actually welcoming and articulating and acknowledging an ambivalence which looks at men and women as being co-partners in this. And then obviously men are hurt by patriarchy, men become sufferers of patriarchy at a level of indoctrination, a level of value-based indoctrination, and then they obviously become perpetrators of patriarchy, who then go on to abuse women, hurt women, commit say, acts of violence against women. So both realities coexist, as Hooks very clearly points out. It does not erase or lessen male responsibility for supporting and perpetuating the power under patriarchy to exploit and oppress women in a manner far more grievous than a serious psychological stress and emotional pain caused by male conformity to rigid sexist role patterns. So both the entire trauma of conforming to rigid sexist patterns, as well as the violence committed or perpetrated against women by men, need to be acknowledged, need to be articulated, and need to be seen as part of one system, part of one narrative of patriarchy. And unless we can do that, then we are constantly falling back, we're constantly replicating the very rigid binary of men and women, powerful and powerless, agentic and agency-lessness, which is not the way, not the model, ideally, with which we could look at, we should be looking at any politics of power. And the same could be said about colonialism, the same could be said about racism, etc. So, it's a more complex system of negotiation with power, with articulation, with appropriation, with misappropriation. So all these different micro-activities need to be taken into consideration, instead of taking a reductionist macro model of the powerful and the powerless, which is something that Hooks clearly wants to move away from. And then she goes on to say, throughout this essay, I stress that feminist advocates collude in the pain of men wounded by patriarchy when they falsely represent men as always and only powerful. So it's a false representation, it's a pseudo-representation of men being always and only powerful, as always and only gaining privileges from the blind obedience to patriarchy. I emphasize that patriarchal ideology brainwashes men to believe that the domination of women is beneficial when it is not. Right, so the entire thing becomes a brainwashing, a pseudo-indoctrination, which teaches men supposedly that they will have positions of privilege, they will have positions of power and authority, they will gain things from life if they become patriarchal in quality and character. Well, actually, in reality, what it does really is it takes away men from their really agentic selves. It takes away men from their positions of agency, from their articulations of agency, when they become a sort of a they collude and conform to certain codes of conduct as expected, as demanded by patriarchal principles. So in that sense, men become the victims of patriarchy before they become perpetrators of patriarchy. So this entire idea of victimhood and perpetrators is complicated in this particular essay, and she's obviously moving away from any sort of standard ontology of victimhood and perpetrator way. And she says we need to look at the simultaneity of these categories, that men become victims as well as perpetrators, sometimes at the same time, in certain occasions. And we need to acknowledge this ambivalence, we need to acknowledge this simultaneity if we are to understand any complex understanding or any complex discourse of patriarchy in terms of how it operates and how it affects the human beings, men and women. Okay. And then she goes on to say quite clearly over here, as long as men are brainwashed to equate violent domination and abuse of women with privilege, they will have no understanding of the damage done to themselves or to others and no motivation to change. So the question over here is for men to unlearn the position of patriarchy, to unlearn the privilege of patriarchy and recognize the privilege to be actually a lack, recognize the privilege to be a problem. So, as long as men consume patriarchy as some kind of a privileged machine, some kind of a vending machine for privilege. They will never question patriarchy. So men need to be told, men need to be, men need to understand or engage with the instrument, with the discourse, and patriarchy operates by first brainwashing men. And this act of brainwashing is an act of violence, is an act of abuse, is an act of suffering that men go through without really acknowledging, without really being aware of it. Right? So this awareness should be sort of taught to men, should be told to men, should be articulated to men. And this articulation can only happen when we identify the problem as patriarchy. Right? So unless we can do that, these things will always operate without any change, without any motivation for change. So patriarchy demands of men that they become and remain emotional cripples. So this is a very sort of graphic description of how patriarchy affects men in a very negative way, where she says that patriarchy demands of men that they become and remain emotional cripples, because in a patriarchy has a standard model of masculinity, and that model of masculinity, that hegemonic model of masculinity, is that men should not express their emotions. Men should be as emotional as possible. Men should be functioning machines of patriarchy, and any act of emotions, any expression of emotion by men is considered to be untoward, inappropriate, and then is subject to shame. And that's something which make men emotional cripples in the perspective of patriarchy. Since it is a system that denies men full access to their freedom of will, it's difficult for any man of any class to rebel against patriarchy, to be disloyal to the patriarchal parent, to be the parent female or male. So again, we're looking at a very complex situation where the patriarchal parent could be female or male. Both are equally possible. And patriarchy is a system, rather than giving true privilege to men, actually denies men true privilege by denying them access to their emotional selves, by taking them away from the emotional selves, by indoctrinating them into emotionlessness. And this indoctrination into emotionlessness is something the patriarchy operates and thrives by. And because it happens this way, it's difficult for any man of any class to rebel against patriarchy, to be disloyal. So patriarchy, like any grand narrative, demands loyalty. And like any grand narrative, it rewards you for being loyal. So if you become a patriarchal person in a certain situation, you're rewarded socially, culturally, discursively, by the condition, by the space around you. Okay, now then we have an example. The Hooks gives an anecdotal evidence. She talks about someone that she knew personally, and how the person, it could be her partner, it could be a friend, it could be someone that she is very close with emotionally for a period of time. And she says how she notices the trajectory of change, how that becomes different, how this same person goes to certain situations which changes them dramatically, from being a very sensitive, understanding of patriarchy into someone who becomes a perpetrator of patriarchy, in a very hegemonic way. And this is what she says. The man who was my primary bond for more than 12 years was traumatized by the patriarchal dynamics in his family of origin. When I met him, he was in his 20s. While his formative years had been spent in the company of a violent alcoholic dad, his circumstances changed when he was 12 and he began to live alone with his mother. So again, we're looking at a childhood which is a childhood of abuse, because he grew up in a household where his father was alcoholic, where his father was violent, where the father was presumably abusive. So that kind of a household obviously was part of his formative phase. And then he moved to a different setting to his mother when he was 12, and he began to live alone with his mother. In the early years of our relationship, he talked openly about his hostility and rage towards his abusive dad. So in the early years of the relationship, the Hooks often listened to him talking about his hostility and his sense of suffering which he experienced from his abusive dad, who was an alcoholic in a household. So obviously he was subjected, the person was subjected to different forms of abuse. He was not interested in forgiving him or understanding the circumstances that had shaped and influenced his dad's life, either in his childhood or in his working life as a military man. Now, obviously, the background of the father becomes very important over here. He was a military man. He grew up in his own time in an abusive childhood, perhaps. And this particular person was not interested to forgive his father, not interested to find out the background of his father, which probably made him what he is. His military background, his own childhood background, etc. But he was very vocal against the abuse that he was subjected to by his father. So in the early years of a relationship, he was extremely critical of male domination of women and children. He, although he did not use the word patriarchy, he understood its meaning and he opposed it. So in the early years of their relationship, he was very vocal in his critique of patriarchy, despite not mentioning it by name, and he was very, very critical of male domination of women and children. His gentle, quiet manner often led folks to ignore him, counting him among the weak and the powerless. So again, look at the easy question between sensitivity and powerlessness. If you're a sensitive man, if you're an emotional man, if you're a man who sort of doesn't want to take up or doesn't want to conform to the codes of patriarchy, you're automatically assumed to be weak and powerless, because strength and power are equated with patriarchal codes. So you can only appear powerful, you can only appear strong if you're conforming either sartorially or at an embodied level or linguistically, the codes of patriarchy. And if you're not conforming to those codes, then you're automatically assumed or interpreted as someone who doesn't really count as an agentic, assertive man. By the age of 30, he began to assume a more macho persona. So the entire idea of macho becomes important over here. Macho obviously is a signifier for a certain kind of masculinity. It could be assertive, it could be violent, it could be a signifier of strength in a very stereotypical way. But that's the kind of persona he began to assume by the age of 30. Embracing the dominator model that he had once critiqued. So interestingly and ironically, he began to assume, he began to appropriate the dominator model that he had once critiqued earlier. So the macho persona becomes his new avatar, as it were. Donning the mantle of patriarch, he gained greater respect and visibility. More women were drawn to him. He was noticed more in public space. His criticism of male domination ceased, and indeed he began to mouth patriarchal rhetoric, saying the kind of sexist stuff that would have appalled him in the past. Now, interestingly, you find this is what I meant a little while ago when I said that patriarchy, like any grand narrative, will reward you for conforming. So this is what exactly happens over here. So he begins to conform to the codes of patriarchy, and immediately these are the superficial rewards that he gets. He gets more visibility, he gets a better form of sense of embodiment, he is taken more seriously, his words are taken more seriously, his presence is taken more seriously. Women are attracted to him, because again, this is a very good example of how men and women become co-consumers of patriarchy. They both subscribe to patriarchy in different degrees. So the moment it becomes a patriarchal man, an assertive macho man, that becomes attractive by default in a certain kind of imagination. And then people, men and women, both begin to find him attractive, respectable, and someone worth being around, someone worth listening to, someone worth taking seriously, right? So he begins to be taken seriously. He begins to be begins to become significant, it begins to be, feel attractive, it begins to feel important only when he assumes his avatar of the macho person, right? So he has to don the mantle of patriarch, the disguise, the discourse of patriarchy. And as long as it doesn't do it, he's not really taken seriously in the office space and the public space. Now, interestingly, notice how this particular sentence where he says, Hooke says that he was noticed more in public space. So the public space becomes a very important space over here. It's a symbolic space where negotiations takes place. It's a symbolic space where decisions which matter, negotiations which matter, commerce, political activity, discursive activity, they all take place in the public sphere in a spectacular way. Of course, all these happen in the private sphere as well, but the sense of sphere is very, very important over here. So the public space becomes a space which is coveted, where your embodiment is most visible, where your sense of self is most visible, where your agency becomes most visible and most performative. So he becomes more visible in a public sphere. He was noticed more in the public sphere. So his visibility, the noticeability around him, his recognition in the public sphere, it goes up. The quotient goes up quite dramatically the moment he dons the patriarchal mantle. And what happens along with that simultaneously is that he begins to mouth very, very patriarchal rhetoric, saying things which are very, very sexist and offensive and regressive. And these are things which once appalled him in the past. But now he's come to a position where maybe it's a subconscious decision where he realizes in order to get visibility and embodiment and a sense of importance in a societal setting, he's required to become patriarchal as a biological man. And unless he does it, he will not get recognition of visibility. So you find this is a very interesting episode because it talks about the sense of embodiment and how embodiment is a spatial category. You get a sense of embodiment in a particular space. So the public space offers you a sense of embodiment, but that can only come if you conform to certain codes of conduct which make you the hegemonic person in the public space. Unless you conform to those codes, then you obviously don't get a sense of embodiment which is privileged, right? And that privileged embodiment becomes something which is connected in a very organic way to a sense of space, to the public space over here, which is being mentioned. So patriarchy, like any grand narrative, thrives in a public space. It becomes a spectacle in the public space. It requires a spectacle in the public space in order to sanction itself as a grand narrative, in order to justify and legitimize its authority as a grand narrative, right? And of course, this person over here changes from being a critique of patriarchy to a consumer of patriarchy. And of course, with the consumption of patriarchy, he gets his rewards in terms of visibility, respectability, etc. So this is a very interesting episode that Hooks points out how one man, one individual changes across different points of time. And this trajectory of change is very important in terms of conforming to a certain code, and how immediately that act of conformation or conformity gets its rewards in a societal span. So I'll stop at this point today, and we'll continue and hopefully begin to wind up this particular text in the lectures to come. Thank you for your attention.